Welcome everybody today to CG's 166th seminar. And today we're focusing on student learning in the midst of the pandemic, the case of the UK. I'm Claire Canada and I'm Professor of Higher Education at UCL, Institute of Education, and also at Birkbeck. And I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education. And so it's within that context that I'm sharing today's presentations. Before I hand over, and let me just tell you a bit about the speakers we have today. We have 3 speakers, all with very interesting and diverse backgrounds. First of all, there is Kyungmee Lee, who is lecturer in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, and she is co-director of the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning. Welcome. Her interests focus on the intersection of online education, higher education, and interestingly, international education. Next, we have Dr. Ben Williamson, who is a Chancellor's Fellow based at the Centre for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. And his research concentrates on digital technologies and educational policies. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Naomi Winstone, a reader in higher education and director of the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey. Naomi is a cognitive psychologist specializing in the process and impact of institutional feedback and the influence of dominant discourses of assessment and feedback in policy and practice. So just before we hand over to our speakers, can we talk about some of the house rules associated with CG seminars? Firstly, all the seminars are being recorded and you'll be able to listen again to the recordings on the CG website. Secondly, we recommend that you select speaker view in the right-hand corner, so that your screen then focuses on the speaker. Please keep yourselves muted unless you're asked to speak or ask a question. And there's no need to have your videos on during the seminar. Now, in terms of asking question, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll look through the questions being asked and I'll indicate by sending you a chat to say whether or not you'll be invited to ask your question. I'll send a gentle reminder during the webinar to post your questions. And if you are asked to address a question, then please unmute yourself and switch on your video, and please state your name and where you're from. So now I'll pass over to our first presenter, Kyungmee Lee from Lancaster. Thank you. Please go ahead. You unmute yourself.
That. All right. Can you see it? All right. All right. Thank you for the introduction, Claire. And today I want to talk about the students' experience during the pandemic. Of course, to capture students' experience, which is very diverse and complex within this short talk is not possible. So I'll try to kind of give my overview of understanding what have happened with online learning at UK University during the pandemic since March, and with the note that this can be one of many possible interpretations of the situation. So going back to March 2020, when it all started, so we all know that UK universities were not very prepared for teaching students online. I would say that it could have been better. We could have been better prepared, just given that many countries have already undergoing this situation a month or 2 months ago even. And then we could at least have secure 2 weeks to prepare. But apparently we find ourselves in the same shoes, or in cases when worse shoes, that we had to move everything online so quickly over the weekend or overnight. So of course, during the spring term, we couldn't expect anything nice. So everyone expected the worst scenario, and seemingly the task was impossible for academics and also students to cope with that rapid change. So what we worried about back then, we were worried about academics being incompetent. We absolutely didn't have any trust, that we thought that they don't have skills to teach online without having any experience previously. And at the same time, when academics were asked to teach online was the exactly same day when they're asked to stay at home alone and isolate, often with their kids. So there was no support system available for academics, unfortunately made us really worried. And all those established distance education in universities like Open University, they have had very systematic approach, team-based support system for academics to develop and teach courses online, which was absent back then. And we're also worried about students being very fragile. So all these massive changes that they suddenly came across, we're worried whether they can cope with it. And subsequently, they could have gone through difficult issues related to their mental health, and also certain students group with particularly disadvantaged characteristics. We worried about them, including international students and students with different forms of disabilities. And on the other hand, there has been, still this narrative is very strong at the moment too. And we worried about students not being responsible about their behavior and potential damage that will have on the neighboring society. And we were not really sure whether, obviously during the strict lockdown period, it was less, but before and after, we're certainly worried about them being not sensible. So that has been our worries. And then I'll argue that during the first spring term, it was not as bad as we expected. So in those circumstances, which is certainly very, very difficult, but most academics were actually working extremely hard, and they show a lot of care, which has been appreciated a lot by students. So student survey of their satisfaction has decreased, of course, compared to how it was before the COVID period, but it was not as bad, especially the items that they had to choose in terms, they had to rate the instructors and tutors' caring approach to them were not at all significantly decreased. So we could see that students, teachers work really hard. And at the same time, from the grand scheme of the picture, the academics were well supported. And based on the interviews that I conducted with academics, that was shared term and shared themes that academic in the virtual space, they came across useful resources which wasn't available before, but made open access and available for them. And it was not only provided by a higher education researcher or online learning researcher, but any academics across discipline who had any experience before in terms of teaching online, they have put their tips and experience and their share amount of, it has been extremely helpful. And when it comes to the students were surprisingly resilient. And academics were actually surprised in their course how quickly students figure out what they're supposed to do within the course level. Of course, there are a lot to discuss outside the course, and then campus life, a lot of things that we can go further. However, at least within the module, at the level of module, and students, the first couple of weeks, students expressed their difficulties and concerns, and they had issue with connection and sort of things. However, once they settled down and calmed down, situation got going, they were really resilient, and they proactively figure out what they have to do. And one of the findings that shared by many academics that is students very proactive in terms of seeking their help and support. They got approached a lot more by students to ask to have the one-on-one chat. And apparently academics spent a lot of hours. And those caring academic who made that kind of proactive attempt of students to reach out to academics possible during the period. At the same time, students were amazingly well connected. I mean, we worried about students being isolated in their dormitory or room. I mean, it's totally true in physical sense, but even before COVID period, that their connections were not entirely physical. If you try to imagine that students, although they have face-to-face contact, many of their communications were actually mediated by technology even before, and they maintained the connection well, and they seek out different ways of being creative in terms of making new contact, and all the social events virtually happen, led by students, were very creative. So what we're trying to say is that the kind of our perception and worries are legitimate. I'm not saying the students' experience were not challenging. However, we should acknowledge this kind of resilience that students show over the during the period of time. So just to kind of summarize what happened is that we walk into situation, certainly with a lack of skills. There's no way for us to argue that we knew what we were supposed to do. However, we learned that we had good skills to learn new things. Even academics who've been teaching the same way for many years learn quickly and how to do, and they learn how to communicate with students online and how to check if students are all right and doing some meaningful learning experience in their courses. And we figure out a lot of things that we've taken for granted are not accessible to many different groups of students. And what we have done is we made rapid changes. Of course, those changes could have happened anyway, but it could have taken very, very long time if we were in the normal circumstances. So those rapid changes that we made, hopefully let's hope that to be made and make education more accessible in the future too. And workload issue was high, not only for academics, but also for students who need to take more than a few modules. And each module had different activity they have to complete. And they learn incredible skills, which can be quite useful for their lifelong journey in terms of how to manage. It's beyond the superficial multitasking skill that they are claimed to have before. It was seriously try to understand and compare different tasks and choose the right order and know exactly where to start and maintain their motivation and self-regulate their behaviors. Of course, I'm not trying to say it was easy for everyone, but certainly we have to see the positive side of it. So September 2020, what happened is that UK University, in my view, were better prepared for second round of doing it with better quality of online provision. However, UK universities were encouraged or pushed to go back to normal and open our campus to our students. So we had our students and tried to do it as we used to do before pandemic. And we had a lot of worries about what is going to happen if we did this. And then that's what is happening now. So in my view, that it's not really about online lectures, quality of online learning and students' experience within very limited sense of what the students are learning. I think there have been great things that students learned during the pandemic. Of course, they lost different things that they should have previously. However, now the students are pushed too hard and they're trying to say that quality of online lectures are not good enough. But it's quite demotivating statement for academics who have tried a lot and put a lot of effort to maintain the quality within their practice. And hearing that from students, angry students, it's not really a good thing. Unsurprisingly or unnecessarily, UK government hasn't been very helpful and saying that if students had a problem, they have to go back to and complain to their universities rather than anyone else. And this is the second challenge that I can see, which is so much more difficult than first challenge, is simply moving things online. So we overcame it well, we did it well in my view. However, this is more another challenge that we are facing currently, which it can be quite damaging in terms of our trusting relationship with our students and the view about the university and role of the university and relationship between university and student, teacher and students. If we approach it in this way, that kind of the negative impact upon a pedagogical relationship after COVID can be more damaging in my view. So this is it for now, and that kind of thoughts need a bit more discussion. Thank you. I can't hear you, Claire. Please.
Sorry, I just wanted to thank you. That was a great start. Some really interesting issues that I'm sure that we'll be able to pursue in question time. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So now let's move on to Ben. Welcome, Ben, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. I'm just going to share some pictures. Which I hope everybody can now see. So I just want to take a little step back from the experiences of students themselves and perhaps in a way go back through the screen and into some of the technologies that have enabled and perhaps are continuing to enable teaching and learning to take place, both during the pandemic over the last few months and at present through various hybrid flexible formats and into the future in whatever formats it takes. So the talk is well, relatively exploratory and it's kind of focusing on the overlap between three particular areas that are of interest to me. One is around the role of private platforms particularly in the public sector and the idea of sort of a platform society where private platforms are taking on more and more public functions. Then concerns about the increasing power and influence that the tech sector has, a global technology sector has had during the particular sort of pandemic period. And then third, the growth of a global education technology industry, in particular in higher education. And my particular interest in bringing these three things together is the way that particular platform providers or digital and data infrastructure suppliers have begun to shift from the emphasis they made early in March about being kind of temporary emergency relief providers to now positioning themselves as long-term models of higher education reconstruction. And I want to talk through some of these ideas about this kind of long-term reconstruction aims in relation just to a couple of quick examples. And one is this document that came out just at the end of last month as a collaboration between JISC, the Higher Education Digital Learning Agency, Universities UK, of course, the sector representative body, Emerge Education, which is an education technology venture capital investment company, and Salesforce. And Salesforce is a Silicon Valley based cloud computing and data provider. So in this particular document, which is part of a big initiative called the Teaching and Learning Reimagined Initiative, we've got this particular document, Digital at the Core, a 2030 digital strategy for university leaders, which sort of sets a template and a pathway towards what higher education should look like in the coming months and years. So this reimagines higher education in terms of what it calls intelligent information networks for personalized engagement and individualized experience, and beyond that, actionable strategic intelligence. It's very much focused on the idea of drawing together multiple data streams about students' every activity into one kind of interoperable core infrastructure sort of service or system. So the report particularly talks about data empowered universities of the near future that are running on advanced analytics. And it specifically calls upon the example of consumer market leaders such as Netflix, Apple, or Uber, which apply data-driven decisions to provide dynamic experiences based on an individual consumer's information. For this kind of document, and there are many, many others with this kind of, transformative, digital transformative kind of aspiration, they seem to anticipate a higher education which is transformed by the datafication of all student activities, so the student becomes visible through his or her data. There's a kind of sense of a kind of commodification of degrees into unbundled components that are provided by different platform providers who've taken apart the idea of a conventional degree and are offering different kind of credentials or modular degrees in online formats and so on. And then there's this idea of a kind of personalization of the student experience, which is enabled by data analytics and artificial intelligence. Now, in terms of how this kind of imagined higher education might be enacted, I suppose the instructive to look at Salesforce as the particular partner on this report, because Salesforce itself has been pushing during the pandemic period what it calls its education cloud service for higher education. And the general manager of this program at the launch of the JISC piece said that there's a tremendous opportunity to reimagine how the sector in the UK should evolve using tech, a pivotal step required to thrive in the next normal. So what Salesforce provides is what it calls an education data architecture, which offers a 360-degree view of the student through data analytics. It's an interoperable, intelligent network that integrates together information from the Student Information Service, from the Learning Management Service or system, and from a range of third-party apps that are also interoperable with the particular system. So Salesforce sees or wants to see universities, as it specifically says, as nimble software organizations that it likens to Amazon one-click, Spotify recommendations, or the Apple Watch's health tracking for higher education. So it's very much taking this kind of model provided by the big platform and cloud computing companies, data infrastructure providers, and applying them to higher education. Now, of course, Salesforce is not the only big tech organization trying to work in this space at the moment. We've probably all heard about the huge increase in uptake of Coursera, massive open online courses over recent months. I think that it had reported a 600% increase in enrollments in 1 month alone. So companies like Coursera are flocking into the higher education space all over the world, as you can see in one of the little infographics on the screen here. The significant thing for me about Coursera is one that, again, it focuses on this kind of idea of an unbundled degree with different job relevant, credit ready modules and courses available as a kind of marketplace that students can choose and select from. And also that Coursera, having offered what it called the Coursera for Campus service for free to universities over recent months, so that universities could kind of purchase a bundle of different course components to offer in the absence of a kind of in-person degree. Well, Coursera is now suggesting that it's going to start charging for that, so that universities who are still seeking a decent online degree provider can purchase it directly from them. Now, all of what Coursera is doing is utterly dependent on Amazon Web Services. This is the back end. So if you enroll on a Coursera course, this is entirely situated in the giant AWS ecosystem. So one of the key software engineers at Coursera, I've got a quote here, says, "Quite simply, Coursera could not exist without AWS. We rely on it every single day for the speed, service, agility, and scale required to serve our students worldwide and provide deeper insights into student learning that would not be possible without it." So Coursera seems to be offering this idea of a kind of like a cloud-sourced degree, where a particular provider can select different modular components that are available through the infrastructure of the Amazon cloud, and kind of rebundle those together as a package, which then other providers can purchase. So I'm aware I'm really out of time, but I just want to conclude by suggesting there's something here about the way that higher education is being approached and reimagined, which resonates with some arguments from Marion Fourcade and Jeff Gordon about an emerging form of digital statecraft. And they talk about statecraft as a particular mode of knowing about society and then intervening in it through the traces of data about people and events. But they say in this kind of digital state, that governments often don't have the technical capacity to perform all of this analysis. They have to outsource that to the tech sector. Machines take over certain governmental and state operations, they suggest, which then runs the risk of creating intense tensions and challenges when public functions are being determined by particular private interests, which might run against other ways of thinking about the values and the purposes of public services. I'm aware I've slightly gone over my time. I'm very sorry about that, but I will finish there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ben, and for sticking to time. So finally, and again, you raise, I mean, it's always so interesting how you've picked up very different sorts of issues to the previous speaker. And there's plenty to food for thought in what you were discussing. So let's now move on to Naomi, and the floor is yours, Naomi.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm not going to show any slides because I want to share with you some reflections that I have from the last 8 months from my work with both staff and students, not just at my own institution, but other institutions in the UK, Europe and Australia. And I was reflecting on the conversations that I've had, the kinds of challenges that have been raised. And I came up with 3 key themes that keep coming up in conversations. And this is what I'd like to talk through with you today. So these 3 themes that I think keep recurring. One is trust. Trust in each other, trust in systems, the trust that students place in us, and the trust that we place in students. The second is vulnerability. Vulnerability in terms of the experience of vulnerability, but also reflecting on the value of sharing vulnerability. And the third is the importance of self-efficacy, of confidence, of where we feel we are capable of achieving change in a very uncertain environment. So I'm going to work through these 3 themes, thinking about what they tell us about student learning in the pandemic, from the experiences of students themselves, staff, and then finally thinking about the wider sector. So if we start with students and their learning in this pandemic context, what I want to do is to also pull out what we've learned as a sector and what this means for post-pandemic pedagogies in higher education. So for students, they were catapulted into an unfamiliar and uncertain learning environment. And particularly for those students who are new to higher education this year, they'd been through an incredibly tumultuous summer with the exam grading crisis that had really eroded, I think, their sense of trust in systems and how they worked for their own benefit. And even the students who were returning to higher education, they found their experience of university to change overnight. Very, very different forms of learning and teaching and environments. So what does this mean in terms of trust? Well, I think what we've learned through this process is the real importance of the relational in learning and teaching. It's not just about the tools that we use, and it's not just about the content. The people in the process are absolutely fundamental to ensuring that this learning experience is positive for our students. And so we've talked a lot about care. We've talked a lot about connections and presence and relationships, and ensuring that we can build trust between students themselves, between students and staff, and students and their universities. And one way in which we've seen that work in relation to student learning is the large-scale deployment of safety net policies that were put in place last semester to ensure that students' grades were not adversely impacted by the pandemic. In terms of vulnerability, I think we've really learnt to take more perspective when we're thinking about our students and the reasons behind their behaviour, rather than assuming what we think their behaviour is telling us. So this has really opened our eyes to the fact that for many students, they felt exposed in the second semester of last year. When having to learn online, they found that their education became entangled with the personal for them. Learning from home, what were they revealing about their home lives? What did they feel uncomfortable revealing? What did it say about their access to a good internet connection, to a quiet working space? Many had caring responsibilities and simply couldn't turn on their Zoom cameras. Yet there was a rhetoric of students not engaging with the black screen of Zoom, demonstrating lack of engagement. Actually, we needed to really understand for many students the challenges that they were facing and not making assumptions about what their behaviour did or did not tell us. And finally, for students, in terms of self-efficacy, I think, again, we've learnt not to make assumptions that our students will know how to do things that maybe we might take for granted. And one particular example that I'd like to draw upon is the large-scale shift in assessment that we used as a result of the pandemic. So a lot of traditional exams were changed into open book online exams, where students had a longer window of time to complete a paper. And I think this seemed like a simple form of assessment, but we know that students found this incredibly difficult in understanding what the different expectations were for this form of assessment. It wasn't a piece of coursework and it wasn't a sit-down exam. It was very different. And really, they needed a lot more opportunity to prepare and feel confident in taking that different form of assessment. So moving to staff who were also catapulted into an unfamiliar learning and teaching environment with completely new approaches to learning and teaching, which were covered very well in depth by Kyungmee. What have we learned here? Well, I think there are challenges again with trust, and particularly trust in a system in higher education that's heavily characterised by metrics and performativity. So we know that there have been concerns from staff about whether student evaluations of teaching will carry the same weight in an uncertain environment, and also how to balance their time to still keep and maintain performance against research targets when the workload associated with learning and teaching has just been incredible and taken over in many cases. Another dimension of trust that I've come up against is trust in students, and this particularly again comes back to assessment and many of the different forms of assessment we've used in online learning. There's been huge discussion and debate around remote proctoring and academic integrity and how we secure academic integrity with online exams. And my concern about this is that it perhaps promulgates a message of distrust in our students, that exams are there to be cheated upon, rather than thinking perhaps in more depth about assessment design and how we can create assessments that enable students to demonstrate their learning in meaningful ways that don't have the same concerns around academic integrity. Vulnerability for staff. For me, a big thing here has been learning about the value of sharing our vulnerabilities. The most successful teacher-student relationships that I've seen in this pandemic context have been ones where the lecturer has been very willing to expose their vulnerabilities and say to students, this is brand new to me, I'm learning just as much as you, let's work through it together. And that sense of we're all in this together has led to some really authentic and stronger relationships between staff and students. Finally, in terms of self-efficacy, I think the big thing we've learned here for staff is the importance of sharing successes and challenges. There's been an incredible amount of practice sharing going on across the sector, people being willing to share things they've tried, things that have worked, things that haven't worked. And I think that's really helped to build confidence by getting ideas from each other and sharing. So just to wrap up, we've got some reflections about the sector and the impact on the sector of this massive change to student learning that's taken place. Again, trust is a theme that comes out for me. We've learnt perhaps that outside of higher education, there's very little understanding of what we actually do and how higher education actually works and what online learning actually looks like. Reflected upon the huge barrage of unfounded critique from the media for higher education, that online education is somehow poorer than face-to-face teaching, when in reality, our students are sometimes getting a lot more at the moment than they would have done pre-pandemic. And the sense that universities were all closed in spring, when many staff were working over and above contracted hours just to maintain student learning. So how can we raise awareness of the huge efforts that have gone into learning and teaching and give people a better idea outside the walls of higher education of what online learning actually entails? Moving on to vulnerability, similar for me around sharing. I've seen a breakdown, I think, of some of the sense of competition between universities towards more sense of collaboration, a sense that we're sharing challenges and being willing to admit that we're all learning and this is all new. And I think that's a really positive change. My final point then relates to self-efficacy for the sector and how we move forwards from this unprecedented period of time that we've experienced. I think what we've learned as a sector is that things can change, and things that we thought were incredibly difficult to change actually can and have. So the question for me then is how we sustain those changes and make sure that whatever happens in the future is strengthened as a result of this experience. So we've seen a creative explosion in learning and teaching. I'm constantly in awe of the things that colleagues at my university have done to support student learning and creatively think about different ways of doing things. Learning and teaching is more firmly on the agenda of universities than it ever was before, and that can only be a good thing. So how do we sustain these positive changes? And I have two provocative points to end with. The first one is, when this is over, do we need to go back to the widespread use of large lectures as a dominant pedagogy? What are the alternatives, and do we need to cram students into lecture halls? Second, and this one is most close to my heart, do we need to go back to cramming students into exam halls to sit timed written examinations, when we've seen actually very positive responses to different forms of assessment that don't require perhaps some of those inauthentic exam situations? In some disciplines, of course, there is real value and importance to exams, but do we need widespread use of exams? So in conclusion then, I think moving forwards from this requires us to think about trust, transparency, mutual care across the sector, and also this creative mindset that we can do things differently.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Naomi. I think this whole idea about the erosion of trust is indeed very, very important. And in fact, one of the themes in the questioning is really about the impact of the erosion of trust on student lecturers and on also, both teachers and students. I mean, what does it mean if we are seeing a public discourse which is questioning what universities are doing, by definition, questioning what lecturers are doing, and giving them a bad press? What does that mean for student learning?
I think those questions are just so important in understanding perceptions of higher education. And I think the perception that perhaps online learning and teaching is inferior is unfounded. But we need to do more to explain what that entails. And I think some of the things that Kyungmee talked about really show the value in what's happened as well as the challenges.
Great, good. Diana, I understand, Diana Lillard, I understand you'd like to ask a question of Kyungmee. What is your question? Would you like to turn on your audio?
Yes, I think. Can you hear me okay? And you can see me, I think.
Yeah,
Good.
thank you.
Okay. Well, Kyungmee, that was a very interesting reflection on what both teachers and students think. And undoubtedly, teachers have been flung into this really difficult process with very little support. And I was wondering if they were reflecting to you that they were expecting to get more help from the university. Who did they think should be responsible for helping them through this very difficult time?
I think, thanks for your question. I think the basic assumption here and basic understanding that everyone had over the period of time was that it's none of us. I mean, there's no one who is actually responsible for the situation. So there is shared understanding to begin with, although there are a lot of complaints that how university have communicated to their staff in terms of not giving enough support, which is necessary for them to do their job, but ask too much pressure on, put the pressure on the individual tutors. So there has been discussion, but it's not like necessarily that individual staff try to get something immediately out from the university. However, the one thing that quickly just mentioned is during summertime. So during springtime, it was very difficult, although university tried to put something together very quickly and the documentation to circulate to individual tutors and so on. But during summertime, actually, many universities come up with a more sustainable or systematic support system, including 4-week training and different technical units that actually working with individual tutors to walk through it. So I think universities have tried their best during the summertime once the situation got a little bit going, but in springtime, of course, that it wasn't very well expected.
Sure. Thank you very much.
I'm going to go straight on to Richard Budd. And Richard, I believe you have a question for Ben. I think we've addressed the other question that was posed by Shahadat Khan. So can we go on to Richard Budd and your question for Ben?
Yeah, hi Ben, thanks for that. Obviously we could collect, in terms of using these infrastructures, we could collect a lot of different data on different kinds of behaviors. Let's say, for example, universities do collect kind of like virtual learning environment usage data and that kind of thing. And some of that is quite useful and some of that can be used to help support teaching and learning. Some of it can also be kind of misused by universities to kind of understand what problems are or aren't in the system. How do we keep an eye on that, and also on the potential for some of those for some of those big companies to collect data on all sorts of things that they then make profit out of, in terms of broader learning analytics and those kinds of things that then potentially undermine ways of learning and teacher-student relationships?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't have, I mean, I can see completely the value in collecting certain forms of data. I mean, there is a risk in some of the forms of sort of machine learning sort of analysis that seem to be at the heart of some of these imaginaries, that you're assessing and potentially even sort of individually profiling students on the basis of historical patterns which are in existing data sets and all of the issues that raises. My sense is that if we're going to be generating educational data, particularly from this kind of 360-degree kind of perspective on students, as it seems to be increasingly described, then that kind of work really needs to be underpinned by very tightly specified educational purposes, which are negotiated by those specifically working within the sector, based on arguments about what constitutes sound pedagogy, what kind of data would make a good proxy or a reliable proxy for measuring certain forms of performance and so on. My sense is a lot of the time data collection isn't done from a sense of this kind of sense of the purpose of higher education, as I think many people in the sector would describe it, but is more focused on a kind of set of purposes around employability and ensuring that students have certain sorts of competencies, which are the kind of competencies which seem to be increasingly defined by those very platform operators who see a business space within the sector.
Okay, and the next question is for Naomi. Naomi, we have a question from Ingrid Schneider. Ingrid, would you like to your video and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Naomi, I was really interested in what you were saying about trust. I think it is an essential part when it comes to relationship quality within the student, faculty, or staff relationships. And now I wonder how, for instance, teachers can handle or detect some signals about trust or distrust, because the whole environment is changed due to the pandemic. And I wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question. And perhaps in response, I'll think about particularly the loss of trust of our students in staff and perhaps in their institution and sector. I think how we detect a loss of trust, I would slightly reframe it in that if we want to really build trust, then that has to be done proactively. So rather than waiting to try and detect when it's gone wrong, proactively really trying to build that trust from the start. And I think this is why there's been so much emotional labour that's had to go into the work that's gone on over the last 8 months, and why the workload has increased for many staff who genuinely care and really want to see students feel that they are getting a good experience and that are confident in these difficult times. So it's why often we had to reframe conversations when we were talking about approaches to learning and teaching away from the tools and the platforms that were being used as the primary focus of the conversation to the relational first. And how do we start with that relationship and that relational climate, and then think about how we use technology to facilitate learning and teaching in those kinds of environments. There's one other thing I would say about trust, and that is making sure that the discourse doesn't lead to pressure and focus on individual lecturers to be the ones who are developing and building trust, because there's also wider systemic factors at play. In simple terms, are academics enabled to build trust? Do they have capacity, and has the environment created that ability for them to be able to do it? How do the structures and systems within a university and within the sector influence what individuals are meant to do? So I don't think we can put it down to an individual to either build or detect trust on their own, because of the interrelationships with the wider environment and the systems that surround the work of that individual.
Great, thank you for that. Now we have a question, Maraja Ivancheva, and I believe it's actually, you want to address it to everybody. So can we take this opportunity to address her question, and also for you to wind up and add any issues that you want to bring the session to an end?
So my question, yeah, I'd say it's a bit more to Kyungmee and Naomi, because I think Ben's clarified some of these issues in his, but I wanted to ask you about so I didn't understand from the start if your reflections are based on current ongoing research, but I want to understand better the political stakes for the context of teaching and learning. So what you're focusing on is just teaching and learning. And we are actually facing a very different drama at our universities, with a lot of trade union struggles, a lot of anti-casualization claims that have been going on, a lot of conflicts between senior management, middle management, and workers, of how we're going to go online, not go online, do face-to-face, and so on and so forth. And so I'm quite curious as also, how you see the restructuring of the whole sector that the COVID pandemic has been used to initiate or to exacerbate has been functioning on these teaching and learning relations, because otherwise it all sounds a bit stripped out of context. Thanks a lot.
So Naomi, do you want to start with that? I mean, which one of you wants to address that question first of all?
I mean, I don't mind to.
Okay.
It's all right. So, I mean, thank you so much for a great question. I mean, I saw another question above there that I totally agree with the comment made by Naomi in her previous response that actually it shouldn't be considered individual teachers' responsibility to set up that trust issue, because it's really related to what this question is about, that there is so much more complex political landscape existing. So I don't really think that COVID-19 is particularly raised new issues. I think those are hidden complexions and complex tension already existing within the higher education as a sector. But of course, COVID pandemic revealed that complexity of it. And then now we're actually kind of coming toward seeing the situation, which often come across quite serious sense of anger in this context. So it's very difficult, but I have to really focus. I think for when it comes to student learning and teaching, I really want to state that both students and teachers and all individuals involved in higher education have been trying really hard, and we put in enormous amount of effort in these things to create the trust relationship and try to get things going toward the standard that we think that's good for us and for our students. But the problem is, what is not very helpful in this context is we have, and Naomi has beautifully touched upon it, but how media is portrayed it and how government is trying to communicate it, also uncertainty created by an unnecessary helpful discourse created by this major sounds is really helpful. It's really unhelpful and that it dismisses a lot of effort we have put in our daily base, and then everything that we have done come out as very problematic outcome. So of course, the great question, I don't have an answer to the question, Maria, but my view is that, yeah, that's complexity is something that we have to keep our minds in. And I think at least while we're trying at the very micro level, we should really know that it's not only us, the systematic and political support should come across to support our will. And that's the only way that we can have good relationship with our students.
Right. Naomi, do you want to pick up on that now?
Yeah, I'll just add something briefly, which is I think a really important point that Maria's raised, that actually a lot of the long-term impacts of what's happened, particularly in political terms, we won't necessarily know until a lot later on, and a lot of very well-meaning changes that have been made may have unforeseen impacts on particular groups of individuals who work in higher education later down the line, and that's something that's really important to keep in mind. And one example that does spring to my mind is this balance between research and teaching pressures, which have become very much come to the fore within conversations, and some very well-meaning line managers may be saying, well, in which case then we'll relax the expectations for you on research to free up more time to spend on teaching. But is that in the long term going to disadvantage some academics over others who perhaps have not spent so much time on their research, wanting to spend more time on teaching and looking after students? And also, what does it mean for colleagues who are on teaching focused contracts who don't have that extra capacity to be freed up by relaxing the focus on research targets? So many of these things really need thinking through to make sure that they don't exacerbate differences that are already there between different groups of people who work within higher education. And some of those impacts, I think, may be hidden, and we may not know the long-term impacts until much further down the line.
Ben, what are your observations?
I mean, I suppose that, you know, one of the real issues, and I think Maria will be aware of this, is around the potential for increasing casualization and precarity for certain forms of certain teaching staff who are, you know, perhaps required primarily to teach on these online platforms where it appears that, you know, some parts of a degree provision may well be outsourced, and that opens up a very difficult space for certain forms of academic teaching staff who may find themselves working for commercial platforms as much as, or if not more than, they are working for sector providers in their current form. Those are the kinds of possibilities, I think, that come out of some of the kind of reimagining or transformative visions, of which there are now many. I think we should be trying to tease out and figure out what are the, you know, the difficult, thorny implications of that. And perhaps, as Maria suggests, you know, what's the role of the UCU in this, working closely with unions to ensure that issues around, you know, decent working conditions and workload and so on are protected, as certain academics will possibly experience a fairly drastic shift in the way they teach.
I think we've got 4 more minutes, so let's try and squeeze in 2 more questions. First, Yanya, are you around?
Yep.
Fantastic, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks, Claire and everyone. Yeah, okay, here I am. I just have a question for Ben. I realize this is a UK-focused webinar, but I think it's still relevant to and for UK to think alternatively and look at how it's like elsewhere. So I'm wondering, Ben, if you've noticed a different uptake of proprietary platforms in different education settings, particularly, you know, are we seeing a different varieties of unbundling in less marketized systems? So I know you've been doing work with Anna Hogan about mapping globally what's happening with these proprietary platforms, but did you notice, like, you know, differences in institutional or system or state kind of responses?
I suppose, yeah, I mean, there's clearly geopolitical, contextual factors that will shape the ways in which some of these platforms are taken up. I think that, you know, many of them are clearly transnational organizations with increasingly kind of globalizing operations, as we might see with, you know, an organization like Coursera and so on, and organizations that are actively trying to enter all sorts of markets. The biggest uptake of Coursera, for example, was in Southeast Asia. The amount of investment in education technology and online learning platforms was primarily in China and India, where they're servicing large numbers of students who are at home and seeking private supplementary platforms and so on. But then there are also issues like the European Union's emphasis more on open educational resources. I don't know to what extent that has sort of mediated or moderated the sort of the use of proprietary or for-profit platforms. It would be interesting to know in further detail. So yes, there's both a kind of globalizing tendency of these platforms, and, you know, we're right to be suspicious and skeptical about the extent to which these will be transformative in the way that they're often projected to be. But I think we're also right to try and follow where their ideas sort of take a home, you know, in organizations like some of our sector agencies and so on, and to track how that then embeds in particular institutions, but also do some comparative work. And I think we're just at the very, very beginnings of, like I say, my work's largely been trying to map who's working in this space, what are the kind of relationships, primarily in the UK. We need to do that much more comparatively, I think.
I realized I was muted. So I'm just apologizing that regrettably we don't have time to address Shahadat Khan's question. My sincere apologies for that, as I need to bring the session to a close. Can I remind everybody that our next webinar will be on Thursday, and it'll focus on issues about migration and sorry, the exact title, I just get it, it's on the chat faction. It's refugees and higher education, transnational perspectives on access, equity, and internationalization. So I'm sure that will prove to be another stimulating session. Can I just end by thanking our three speakers and congratulating you on your presentations. They were great. And thank you for such a stimulating session. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.